fought the way down to ordinary people. The majority of the prisoners were arrested by their units and then transferred to S21, on occasion in close coordination with the accused. S21 staff also actively participated in arresting people, as witness KWO9 stated. Sometimes they had us go arrest them ourselves in S21's vehicles. Finally, for some high-level targets, false pretense was used to lure the victim to the vicinity of S21 where he was then seized. Prisoners entered S21 on a daily basis, usually arriving in covered trucks. They were unloaded from the truck and temporarily kept at houses outside of the main compound. The prisoners were then blindfolded and bound before being taken to the main compound. You will hear witnesses KW10 and KW11, former guards at S21, describe how prisoners arrived at the main compound, handcuffed and blindfolded. S21, or rather the renowned Cambodian artist and S21 survivor Van Nat drew this powerful rendition of this arrival. For the victim, Building E was usually the first stop. Here, witness KW07 would record their entry and question the prisoners about their name, birthplace, and position so that he could create a short biography. The prisoners were then photographed by S21 photographers, including witness KW16. The photograph would later be developed and attached to the summary biography as witness KW07 and KW16 will confirm at trial. The prisoner's arrival and details would be recorded in a prisoner's list, and eventually his execution would also dutifully be recorded in an execution log. No one knows exactly how many victims went through this process, but more than 5,000 prisoner photographs have survived, as well as many of the biographies and an enormous quantity of prisoners and execution lists. This photograph is one example. And here is an example of one of the biographies with an attached photo. S21 biography of Pia Chai. This is the biography of Pia Chai alias Sur. It contains biographical information on Pia Chai, including his place of birth, age, and parents' names. It indicates that prior to his arrest, he worked in foreign commerce and that he was arrested at the Ministry of Commerce on the 2nd of February 1977. Once the registration process was complete, guards would then take the prisoner from Building E to their cells. KW21, a former guard at S21, will testify that new arrivals at S21 were usually stripped of their clothes at this point, and husbands and wives who had been arrested together were separated never to see each other again. In this way, the civil party last saw his wife alive. To this day, all he has left of her is a copy of her S21 photograph. Very young children were usually left with their mothers, however, to make their detention easier until they too were killed. The cell number of each prisoner was then recorded by witness KW07 so that prisoners could be easily found by the interrogators. Which cell a prisoner ended up in depended on a number of factors, including the gender, nationality, and importance of the prisoner. Female prisoners were often kept on the ground floor of Building C. Building A and a house outside of the main compound, known as the special prison, housed important prisoners. Foreigners were held separately from Cambodians. In addition, interrogated prisoners were kept separate from prisoners who were awaiting interrogation. Prisoners were often kept in individual cells while awaiting interrogation and then moved to a larger group detention cell after their interrogation was completed to await their execution. Probably the clearest indicator of the primary function of S21 and its status within the security apparatus can be discerned by the types of prisoners who were sent there. The combined S21 prisoner list was created by merging two lists together. The first list were of 9,805 people who were executed at S21. The second list was of 4,186 people who were arrested and sent to S21. Both lists were compiled by the Documentation Center of Cambodia based on original prisoner lists and execution logs found at S21. Our office combined the two prisoner lists and eliminated duplicate entries. The result was the combined S21 prisoner list, which contains the names of 12,380 S21 victims. It is the most comprehensive list of the S21 victims that has ever been compiled. And the accused has acknowledged that it is essentially accurate and that indeed the number of victims is in fact higher. Much of our knowledge about who perished at S21 stems from that list. As this chart shows, 78% of the prisoners at S21 came from either a DK government office or military unit. A further 4% of the prisoners were described as being the wives of arrested cadres. Roughly 3% of the prisoners were identified as being Vietnamese. The remaining 15% of S21's prisoners were a mix of new people, former Khmer Republic soldiers and officials, people described as ethnic Chinese, intellectuals, a small number of foreigners from various countries, and a number of entries that were too vague to allow for categorization. The information in the combined S-21 prisoner list indicates that about 70% of the prisoners were male and that the average age of the prisoners was 29, although this may be high since children were not generally entered into S-21 logs. At average, a prisoner was kept for 61 days before being executed. The combined S-21 prisoner list also demonstrates that many S-21 cadres ended up as prisoners at S-21. At least 190 of the prisoners on the list can clearly be identified as former S-21 staff. By targeting its own cadres and soldiers, the primary function of S-21 is clear: to rid the party of its enemies who, according to the Khmer Rouge slogan, were burrowing from within. By killing the enemy's spouse and children, the Khmer Rouge ensured that all traces of opposition would be erased. The list also illustrates the role played by S-21 in the widespread and systematic attack that was taking place throughout Cambodia. In April 1978, a well-documented purge of the East Zone was ordered by the Khmer Rouge leadership. This chart shows the breakdown of prisoners coming from the East Zone by month. As you can see, the number of personnel entering S-21 from the East Zone was negligible until April of 78, when it suddenly soared. Almost 1,000 prisoners entered S-21 from the East Zone during April, May, and June of 1978. This clearly demonstrates that the crimes the accused committed at S-21 were an integral part of the CPK's widespread and systematic attack on Cambodians' population. Another fact which is certain: for however long a prisoner was held in S-21, he or she would suffer inhumane detention conditions. Prisoners were denied adequate food, water, and medical care, and were usually only removed from their unsanitary and overcrowded cells to be tortured and executed. Prisoners were shackled together in confined, overcrowded cells. Witness KW10 will testify that prisoners in buildings B and C were shackled and handcuffed together in groups of 10 people, sleeping leg to leg the entire length of the room. Witness KW15 will testify that prisoners slept shackled to a bar about 0.7 meters long, and that even those prisoners who had been tortured were denied a pillow or mat to sleep on. The food rations at S-21 were completely inadequate. Witness KW09, a former guard, will testify that prisoners at S-21 received 2 rations of gruel a day, and that these meals were given to the prisoners while they were shackled in their cells. Witness KW10 will testify that prisoners sometimes received even less meals of 1 scoop of rice or soup and no meat or fish. Deprivation of already scarce food rations was also used as a punishment. S-21 prisoners were also subjected to unhygienic conditions. Witness KW15, a former guard at S-21, will testify that prisoners were not permitted to leave their cells to relieve themselves. Instead, prisoners were given pots or ammunition cases to relieve themselves, in which would remain in the cell until a relief guard came on duty. S-21 prisoners were kept and washed in the most degrading manner imaginable. Witnesses KW15 and KW21 will recall the overwhelming stench of S-21 prisoners who were not allowed to bath. These witnesses will also describe how every 7 to 10 days the guards would enter the cells and order the prisoners to remove their shorts, their only item of clothing, and throw buckets of water over them as they lay shackled to iron bars and to one another. At S-21, medical treatment was inadequate. To begin with, the medics were poorly trained. Witness KW20 was only a child, had no medical training, and was illiterate. Yet, by the time he left S-21, only child medics remained, as all the adults had been arrested and killed. In addition to being poorly trained, the medics did not have the appropriate equipment or medicine to treat tortured detainees. In many cases, they were only able to clean the wounds with iodine or saline. This was inadequate because, as witness KW20 will testify, prisoners who had been tortured sometimes had wounds all over their backs, arms, and bodies, as well as serious head wounds and missing finger and toe nails. For further interrogation and torture. Witness KW19, a former medic at S-21, will testify that he was specifically ordered to treat important prisoners after interrogation, so that they were fit to be reinterrogated. Undoubtedly, every prisoner lived in constant fear of torture or death. Not surprisingly, prisoners regularly tried to kill themselves to escape these inhumane conditions. Witness KW15, a former guard at S-21, describes how guards at the beginning of their shifts would have to inspect prisoners in their cells to ensure they were not concealing nails, needles, or other instruments that they could use to kill themselves. Witness KW10, a former guard at S-21, will testify that some prisoners at S-21 were successful in committing suicide. In his testimony, he will recall the extent to which prisoners want to kill themselves and the methods used, such as stabbing themselves with pencils and ballpoint pens, cutting themselves with shards of broken glass, burning themselves with lanterns, and jumping from the upper floors of the prison buildings. Perhaps these illustrations of these conditions will help us understand. This photo appears to have been taken by an S-21 photographer inside one of the group detention cells. You can clearly see the prisoners in the cell in the background, lying on the floor in rows. This painting again by Van Naat shows the inside of a group detention cell. Here you can see a photograph of the inside of a group detention cell as they look today. This photograph of an S-21 prisoner was taken inside one of the small cells inside buildings B, C or D. On the left and right of the picture, you can see the crude brick walls that were built to subdivide the larger rooms into small cells. This painting by Van Naat is a cell portrait inside one of the smaller cells. This photo shows the closeness of each of the small cells to each other. However many days a detainee did spend at S-21, there can be no doubt that every minute of those days was spent under inhumane conditions. Next, I would like to request that my colleague make his statement. The President, the trial chamber may adjourn for 20 minutes until 11 a.m. when we resume our session. So I would like all the audience and participants to come back before 11. Thank you.